Now, recently I've been doing a lot of videos which have been quite heavy on the conception side of things, and I felt, well, let's do a key ships on an aircraft carrier to start off the key ship series 9, which is going to alternate between aircraft carriers and age of sail, because I've listened to the requests, and yes, there are going to be age of sail ships and descriptions in there. So key ships next week, and the next key ships will probably be first rates, and then second rates, and then third rates, and then fourth rates, and then fifth rates, and then sixth rates, and so on. But to start off with, the alternating ones are going to be some aircraft carriers, because, well, why not? It's key ships. It's the year of the aircraft carrier. It seems sensible to be doing aircraft carriers. And it's the 17th of May, and I quite like USS Midway. But I'm going to start off with 3 falsehoods which I commonly hear about the Midway class design. 1, that they came about because the Americans looking at the illustrious class. No. 2, that they are the American equivalent of the illustrious class. No. They're not. They're very much an American design and American philosophy going in there. And 3, that they are in some way not as good because not as many of them are built as Essexes. Well, to be fair, that probably has something to do with the war ending. And the budget goes from being infinite money, we will print all you need, to actually we do have to consider how much we're spending. So we'd like you to consider only having haircuts every other month. Thank you. And so this is the scenario you're dealing with. Okay? I would add, to further to that point, the Midways are in many ways a product of the fact the Americans do look at armoured carriers. They do look at armouring their carriers. They do look at carrier survivability. They look at it just as much as the British and the Japanese do. The thing is, the Americans make the assessment based on their fighting areas, i.e. either the Atlantic or the Pacific, that they will always have a room to manoeuvre. Therefore, they can afford to balance, because you can, under the treaty limitations in terms of the cumulative limits, to get enough ships, enough actual flight decks on the cumulative limits, you have to pick either armour, i.e. survivability, firepower, i.e. air group size, or speed. You can't have all 3. When they're designing the Essexes, there's of course an interest of going, well, we can do this, but if you do it, you are going to add a lot of cost and time to construction. The Essexes are supposed to be a swarm. They're mass producing them. They want to build as many carriers as they can and be able to scale up their production if they need to. The Essexes are in many ways a glorious idea. You take the Yorktown class and you pare down everything to simplify construction you can. And you accentuate everything to make it that's valuable. So basically, you go through a design like the Yorktown class, which, as I've said before in other videos, is pretty much the apogee of American carrier naval doctrine prior to during the treaty system. And then you go, right then, we want to produce something which is equivalent or better to that as quickly as possible. So what did we do in that adds time to construction that we don't really need to do what we want? And what do we need to add on? And how much construction time will it take? And that's one of the reasons why you get the short bow and the long bow versions. Because, believe it or not, they start off by thinking maybe if we put a shorter bow we can save some time. There's all sorts of other things with that one as well, but you know, that is actually one of the considerations which go through. So the Midways, what are they? Well, just because you're doing that to produce the Essexes doesn't mean someone else isn't working somewhere else on the design of the Dream Carrier. The carrier that doesn't have to compromise on survivability, doesn't have to compromise on speed, doesn't have to compromise on air group, can literally have it all. This is why I usually point to the Maltas and the Midways as the equivalents of each other. Because both of them are, to an extent, some war experience also factored into their design, but also both of them are, we now no longer have the brakes on. Basically, the British, with the brakes off, go Implacables, Audacious's, Maltas. Woohoo! The Americans are churning out vast number of Essexes and then go, well, hang on, should we get something while the going is good? And that's what the Midways are. Please note. There is all sorts of discussions about they're built for the Japan invasion and all these things. Yes, I'm sure that is a justification used, but they're also the US Navy remembering the eternal lesson of the Royal Navy. If you want to have decent equipment in peacetime, build it at the end of wartime. When you've still got the massive budget and no one's questioning what you're spending it on. It's far easier to justify your dream construction in a wartime than in wartime than it is in peacetime. Just look at Hood. Just look at half the things the Royal Navy was building towards the end of World War. They were trying it at the end of World War II. Honestly, I think the Maltas are a classic example of that. They're trying it. Friggin' in war ends too soon. Dang it. Dang nappet. You can't, when can you rely on a war lasting a few months longer? And before anyone asks or puts comments below, yes, I do realise that's horrendous in terms of loss of life and all that, but it's a sarcastic joke, okay? So, that's the thing. The Midways are the US learning from history, and this is their dream carrier. And I'd say it's from the Midways, therefore, you get the evolution of carriers as they come afterwards. The Midways are the future, not the Essexes. The Essex Swarm is a glorious high point. It's a glorious crescendo of the power of naval aviation. And I'm looking forward to doing a key ships on them someday. But what it's not is a sign of things to come. Mass producing vast numbers of large carriers is never going to wash in peacetime. It's never going to be the basis for your navy going forward. Having enough ships that you can literally take body blows and, oh, don't worry, there's another two coming up, is not a practical or pragmatic approach to it. And it won't ever be. So instead, what you have is the US Navy building the Midways. That's it. With that being said, shameless book plug. Now, for those who don't know my channel, let me introduce you to something. I'm an academic, hence the doctor. Now, the reason I have that all there is because, honestly, I tell my students to come here and it just makes everything easier if I'm not trying to hide it. It helps win the job interviews. But the one thing I am consistently told in job interviews is, of course, your videos don't count towards, academic selection. They're not proper history. We'll deal with that one another time in another video. But basically, the point I'm making is that I do the shameless book plugs because books are what count towards promotions in academia. And no one's going to promote my book other than me. And it's on its second edition, and thank you very much to everyone who's bought it. I don't get to add new chapters till it's on the third edition, but, keep going. And thank you everyone who's bought it. I hope you enjoy it. It's on Travels, Battles, and Darings. There are more books going to be coming out as well this year, hopefully. Once I'm through with the house move, and everything's sorted. And I'm no longer surrounded by cardboard boxes. There are so many cardboard boxes. So many cardboard boxes. Anyway. So as that, thank you to everyone who likes, shares and subscribes to the channel. If you like the videos, please do, because it really does help the channel grow. And as I said before, what I really like to do is spread the love of naval history. And I'm going to apologise here because, frankly, this needs to be said. This was supposed to go up at 1900 hours this evening. I apologise it didn't. Apologise it's going up later. Principally, it's going up later because when I was checking the sound earlier today, before I had a meeting with the shipshape crew, I found it had blank patches. And I went back to the recorded video, and it didn't have blank patches. So I spent a long time editing and trying to edit around and fix it. That didn't work. So I was re-recording it, then I realised I had the Armchair Admirals live this evening, where I was with the wonderful Drakenfell and the Chieftain. That was great fun. First time I've actually ever done anything online with him. It's brilliant. A really cool guy to work with. And yeah, I was doing that, and well, didn't get time to finish the editing of this. So I apologise. I'm hoping this version will have fixed everything, and this version will be loud enough for you all. I do hope that. So, the conception. This is Midway after commissioning in September 1945. Just a little late, really. Just a little late, really. She looks like, and some people sometimes say, she looks like another Essex. She's not, though. There are differences in that bow line. There are differences in her weaponry. There are differences in her strength deck and her placing of the aforementioned deck. She is conceived, as I've said, from the point of view of the American views on development of aviation. The fact that the strongest, most capable naval aviation is that which launches the most aircraft most quickly. However, you want to also make your aircraft survivable, because no matter how thick an air defense you run, no matter how many aircraft you put in the air, there's always leakers. And anything you can do to make your ships more survivable, whether that's making them easier, less susceptible to damage, so they're easier to repair, so you can more quickly return them to the front line, or they don't take the damage in the first place, so that they can carry on operating, is useful. It's advantageous. And that's the thing about Midway. Don't consider her so much an armoured carrier as a survivable carrier. This is what I try and explain to people at certain points. When we use the phrase armoured carrier, it comes across all these connotations, but think of it more about a scale of, right then, so we've got these three options. Survivability, speed, or air group size. That's what we can go with as a ship, as a carrier. And we've got tonnage limitations, cumulative limitations, and we can adjust these levels up. Well, think about Midway as something which has had the level put up to here. The air group's up here, and the speed's up about here. And that's fairly that makes things understandable. You go, okay, this one's got more survivability than an Essex. This one's got more survivability than a Yorktown. This one's got more survivability than pretty much any carrier the US Navy's been able to operate, other than perhaps maybe the Lexingtons in their first years of equivalency. And that's useful. That's advantageous even for America, because even for America, the Pacific is a big place. Yes, they don't have the same issues that Japan has in terms of infrastructure, which means Japan should probably have gone with armoured carriers a lot earlier and lied more, because anything that makes their carriers more survivable and then less reliant on building new carriers to make up for losses is a sensible thing. But, you know, it's a case of the British went for the survivable carriers because they were looking at, hang on, if we're fighting a Pacific war against the Japanese, we are in the Atlantic Ocean, in the North Atlantic Ocean. Our ships have to go through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, through the Indian Ocean, up the South China Sea, East. That's a long way, and if we want to do major repairs or something, they have to go all the way back to the UK. And if we want to send new ones or build new ones, they have to work up and go. Oh, that's a long. Hence, the survivability thing makes sense. Your survivability you're building into your ship is a function of how readily can we maintain the strength there. So it's basically a case of, we need this much amount of strength on operations to do this. Okay, we need X. to guarantee X's availability, we need Y number of carriers. Well, what happens if we're factoring in damage? Well, you know, if we are able to readily produce as many carriers as we want, then we can factor in, then damage doesn't really matter to us as much, because we can replace them with new carriers, and we've got plenty of time to send those carriers back to be repaired. What happens, though, if you're further away? Well, that's when the survivability, or you have less infrastructure, that's when survivability starts to matter. But, as said, the Midways are very much the American developments and ideas on survivability when they are free of the treaties and they've got some war experience, which makes them a very good design. Really does. Now, when you put this design in the context of survivability, rather than the Americans seeing the illustrious class's performance and looking at the illustrious class when they come to get repaired and fixed in America and going, we want that, it starts to make a lot more sense. Because one of the things that always bugged me when I was reading that first analysis was, well, hang on, why do they only have a 3.5-inch deck then? Not something thicker, because the 3-inch deck of the illustrious class was designed for dealing with 500-pound bombs. There are 1,000-pound bombs going around, and they are causing horrendous damage. Why wouldn't you design for something bigger? You know, why are you going with 7.6-inch belt? Why are you doing this? Not a full 200mm belt at least, you'd expect something like. But then you sort of think, well, hang on, don't think of this as we are adding this on for survival. We are adding this on to make our ship into an armoured carrier. No, we are looking at going, well, if we add this, we are adding this greater percentage of survivability, this greater percentage of strength, this greater percentage of capability. You have 12 boilers, 4 Westinghouse geared steam turbines, supplying 212,000 shaft horsepower. Top speed 33 knots. That's decent. And we go through the rest of the system, we're also looking at it going, well, she has, when she starts out, 18 5-inch guns. 18 5-inch guns. That's a heavy armament. That's a heavy fit. That's a good fit, but it's a heavy fit. And 21 quad 40mm Bofors guns. So that's 84. 84 Bofors. And 28 twin. That's 56 20mm Oerlikon cannon. That's firepower. That's carrying a lot. And the fact is, the structural strength built into her is enough that she can be easily increased and adapted as time goes on. One of the other interesting things is they do reduce the... well, how do I put this? They take off the 8-inch guns, which they'd planned. They'd planned to make them in new Lexingtons for some reason. They went survivable carrier and went, well, let's make them in Lexingtons and have the 8-inch guns. And they also decided to reduce the number of 5-inch guns from dual to single mounts. So that's why they have 18. I'd say also another difference between them and the illustrious class, and I think there is a reason for this, okay? For the illustrious class, the hangar deck was still not made the strength deck level. And the strength deck can carry the most weight. It's part of the structure of the ship. It's the top point of the hull structure. But they make that the hangar level. And so the flight deck becomes part of the superstructure. Now, eventually the Forrestal class do go away and end up with this as being the strength deck, the flight deck as the strength deck. But for the Midways, again, it made sense from a survivability perspective. Because then, if you have it punctured, you still don't have the strength deck damaged. So hopefully, anything that gets through the armour gets set off on the hangar level, doesn't go below the strength deck, doesn't damage that, and therefore doesn't damage the vessel. That's the advantage of it. That's what you're aiming for. And so that's the design, basically. They are big ships. They're powerful ships. Midway herself grows from being 45,000 tons at commissioning to 64,000 tons of decommissioning. That you cannot do that to a ship which is already not already structurally strong. In fact, her nickname was Midway Magic. Rather than Magic Mike, is probably mainly because the movie doesn't come out till long after she's gone, but she is a vessel which I really, really do want to go around. And Midway is herself the only carrier museum in the United States from World War II which is not an Essex class. Could almost make me want to visit California. Well, it does, but I'd like to visit Midway without visiting San Diego. Mainly because I hear it's California to me is full of beaches, and I'm not really a beach person. Not sandy ones. They're far too pristine and weird looking. No. Give me a pebble beach every day. Give me a pebble beach. That I can get to on the sand. So this is her on entry in 1965. So it's long after she's entered service. But when she does enter service, she's pretty much critical. She gets involved in a lot of history. But entering service as she does, at the end of World War II, she is there. She's the flagship for Carrier Division 1 in 1946. She is part of Operation Frostbite, which is testing the new high-powered fighter and the helicopter rescue techniques in work in Labrador Sea. She does all sorts of work with V2s. She is critical for building up the US Navy that's preparing for a future conflict. That's what she's there for, and that's what she does. In fact, far from being a World War II carrier, she becomes the backbone of the Cold War. She serves. I think I've already said this, but I'm going to say this again. 1945 to 1992. She serves 47 years. 48, depending on... Well, let's be honest. She's kind of late in 1945, so 47 years. 47 years. Pretty much the whole of the Cold War, she's there. She's in different forms. She is adjusted to fit each form. Even when she does get, well, let's be honest, and this is why I picked this picture for service, a bit of a rock and roll carrier. Because some people do some refits. And by the way, my favourite story about her, and I'll be getting into it discussing other history, but I'm going to jump ahead to that, is during the Korean Olympics in Seoul in 1988, she is operating in the Sea of Japan, a typhoon comes up, and she's supposed to only be able to do 24 degrees of movement. She does 26, and fine. So she's a rock and roll carrier. I just really wouldn't want to be on it, because even my cast iron stomach might go start getting some regions of seasickness. But that's really not her career, because after the entry phase is over, after World War II is over and she's ended service, the Americans are now sitting there with a whole lot of carriers going, what the frigate do we do with them? What do we do? What do we want to do with them? And she goes straight into basically global expansion of the American presence. She goes into global trips. She operates in the Atlantic, the Virginia Capes, for some more carrier suitability tests in terms of the F-9F Panther in June 1951. That's, of course, after she's had her angled deck, etc., and things, painted on properly. She does all sorts of operations, and she also has crashes aboard her in this time, and the footage of the crashes, for example, of George Chamberlain Duncan's, is actually used in The Men of the Fighting Lady, Midway, and The Hunt for Red October, apparently, according to some sources. Others listed as a few more films than that, others listed as a few less, so I am not inclined to go hunting through several movies for footage of an aircraft crashing, with the fuselage breaking away and rolling down the deck, and the pilot suffering burns. But if you're that way inclined, I'm sure you could provide a list. But that's not my desire does not go to running to watch a load of movies to try and figure out whether it's that footage or other footage. I just don't feel like that. She takes part in Operation Mainbrace. Now, Mainbrace is critical because It's the first establishment of the really large NATO exercises. It's where the US Navy is trying to merge their fleet problems with the Royal Navy's grand exercises. Pretty much that's the rough template of what we call them. That when they brought the Atlantic and Mediterranean fleets together and basically went to war in the 1920s and 30s, and basically the Royal Navy, the US Navy, everyone are sort of trying to bring other fleets in that so they can get the same experiences, because those are the closest you can get to war fighting. And that is what Operation Mainbrace is about. It's about the Atlantic Fleet command structure testing itself out and fighting the option, finding the way it can actually run itself. And that's cool. That's also critically useful, and Midway's there for that. She really is there for that. She does a world cruise in 1954 to 1955, going around the Cape of Good Hope, heading to Taiwan, and being the first large carrier in the 7th Fleet for operations in the West Pacific until the 28th of June 1955. During that period, Midway would take over in the Taishan Islands during the Kumamoto crisis, and that's where 15,000 Chinese nationalist troops and 20,000 civilians, along with their livestock, were evacuated, and she provided the cover for it. She provided the ability to do that. She even found herself in her own racism scandal, or apartheid scandal, in 1955, when she was scheduled to dock in Cape Town, and there was a interesting discussion as to whether the rules of apartheid would apply to the ship while she was in Cape Town. There's lots of different senators and Secretary of States getting involved, and various officials making statements on and off the record. It's always great fun. But in the end, the captain solves it. The captain says that while in port, Midway would be United States territory, as it always was, because it's a warship, so it's always your home territory, and federal United States laws would apply on board the ship. There wouldn't be no apartheid introduced aboard the ship because they were in Cape Town. That would never wash. If we can put it in a different way, if every time a Royal Navy ship went into a country which had laws which didn't allow alcohol, you then turned around and told the crew that aboard their ship they weren't allowed it, you would have had some mutinies. Probably very polite ones, more than likely not involving any actual aggression, more a case of, sir, we're going to have engine trouble before we get there, so we're going to end up in this port where they allow it, or you might find the mooring ropes never get attached. That sort of scenario, but it wouldn't have happened. So, apartheid wasn't coming aboard the ship, and in the end, Hogle, that's Captain Reynold Delos Hogle of her, when they were invited to Hartleydale Stadium, and the concert in the evening afterwards, European and non-European members of the crew have been asked to attend. There will be no segregation whatsoever. If in doubt in these things, leave it to the captain to sort it out. She had a crew of about 4,100 officers and men. At this point, her non-European crew was several hundred. At least 400, possibly more. That wasn't going to be a good scenario to do with 10% of the crew. It just wasn't. And it's 1955 that the modernization saga starts. The saga where they basically try to see how far can they push the Midway design, and how more interesting can they make it, given a closed hurricane bow, an aft deck edge elevator, an angled flight deck, steam catapults instead of hydraulic catapults. The full works. The full works to keep her modern and capable. And she goes in June 1955. She comes out in September 1957. And then they start to test her. And they really start to test her. They start to think that maybe it wasn't that good. Maybe they had pushed things a little bit too far. But they still do well. And in 1965, well, 2 McDonnell Douglas Phantoms flying from Midway credited with the first confirmed kills of MiGs for the Vietnam conflict, using AIM-7 Sparrow missiles to down them. 3 days later than that, we're talking the 20th of June 1965, 4 of Midway's A-1 Sky Raiders, using the FAC Weave, that World War II vintage anti-fighter weapons methodology, managed to down an attacking MiG-17 themselves. Yeah. The FAC Weave. It works on you when you're faster than the opponent who's doing it to you. It's not a good positioning for you. Stay off, fire missiles from range. She does well. She did still lose some aircraft to North Vietnamese air defences, and not everything went to plan, but in 1966 she entered San Francisco Bay Naval Shipyard for a further modernisation. The flight deck was enlarged from 2.8 to 4 acres. The angle of the flight deck landing area was increased to 30.5 degrees. Elevators were enlarged, moved, and increased almost double the weight capacity. If we go back to this lovely drawing, you can really see the changes. You can really see what they're doing to this ship. And more importantly, they're adding further new steam catapults, arresting gear, and centralized air conditioning plant. The stuff you need for the crew, or rather the systems, the air conditioning plant, and the stuff you need for the aircraft, the new arresting gear and catapults for the heavier aircraft. Surprisingly, with all this massive amount of work to take a ship which was originally what you see on the left of the diagrams to via what was in the middle to what is on the right, the cost overran. It went up by some region of $114 million. It meant that they decided not to do the modernization for the Franklin D. Roosevelt. And here's my question. Here is my honest question. The US Navy knew exactly what the Royal Navy had gone through with HMS Victorious. Why on earth were they trying this? I know they do it. I know they achieve it. But it's just not good. Furthermore, this is the modifications which really do start her having the rock and rolling. The rock and rolling is fun. It's fun, and she has to go into a further refit which tries to fix it, and these pictures are her after that refit. Yeah, this is just not good. She then returns to Vietnam for a bit and takes part in all sorts of operations there, including Operation Frequent Wind, which is... how do I describe it politely? It's the evacuation of American civilians and at-risk Vietnamese, i.e. the ones they can grab and they consider they need to grab from Saigon before the North Vietnamese army arrive and take up part in the fall of Saigon. And Midway is critical to that. She offloaded half her regular combat air wing to the Philippines, steamed to Thailand, took aboard some CH-53s, that is Sea Stallions, and some other helicopters they managed to get, the Jolly Green Giant, etc., and did their best. Did their absolute best. Now, earlier in her career, she'd been redesignated to CVA-41, Carrier Attack 41, and in 1975 she's redesignated again to CV-41. After Vietnam, she's off to showing force off the coast of Korea, as 2 US Army officers were killed by North Korean soldiers on the 8th of August when they attempted to cut down a tree. That particular famous incident, which led to the Operation Paul Bunyan. Midway is part of that. It's an interesting thing. You could chart the American diplomacy and war efforts in the whole of these 47 years by where Midway turns up. And this carries on through the 80s and her further upgrades and some tragedies in the 80s. Some real tragedies. She has onboard explosions. She has a bomb accidentally dropped from F-18A Hornet onto Reeves, one of her escorting destroyers. It doesn't kill anyone, but it starts fires and injures 5 sailors, and that's just a run of bad luck. But, and this is really where her summary begins, in 1990 and 1991, she takes part in Gulf War. She is part of Desert Storm. She is one of the 2 carriers. It's her and... who is it with? I think it's her and the Ranger in the Persian Gulf. Yes, her and the Ranger in the Persian Gulf. And the Kennedy and the Saratoga in the Red Sea. And she's still there. Throughout the war, she's there. She's a critical asset, providing critical fire support for operations. As this picture shows, this is from Battle Force Zulu. Just after the 1991 Gulf War, you've got Midway, you've got Ranger and the bomb left, Midway's top left. And then Teddy Roosevelt at the top right, and America bottom right. Her final deployment includes her going to the Philippines to take part in Operation Fiery Vigil, the evacuation of 20,000 military personnel and their families from Clarke Air Base. And that's from the island of Luzon after a volcano, the Mount Pinatubo, erupts. And then she visits Yokosuka, the Japanese harbour. She'd been stationed at a forward base at for much of her career. And then she returns to Pearl Harbor, and from there she returns to Seattle. And finally she becomes a museum ship. And this is something where she is truly, as said earlier, I would love to visit her. My dream is to go around the American carriers someday. That is a plan for me, to go around the American preserved carriers, because there are no preserved British carriers for me to go around. I did my entire PhD thesis on them, and I can't go around them. I think that's why it hit me so much when I actually managed to visit a tribal. It wasn't much better when I visited HMAS Vampire. Honestly, I was sitting on the footbridge overlooking her, just standing there. Thank goodness there was a light show and things going on, so no one thought I was being an idiot. And no one was watching the strange British bloke standing there looking at the destroyer going, "Isn't she pretty?" But there are no carriers surviving from World War II outside of America. And America has all of them, but they also have Midway. They have not only the carriers which were the example of what they built for war, they have the example of the carrier which they built with war experience, freed from the treaty and without the limitations of we've got to mass produce this in volume. So we can afford to build to what we truly think we want. It's not exactly necessarily what they want when they get it. Nothing ever is. Let's be honest, how often are the things you want in life what you want when you get them? Exactly. But she is a major starting point on that route. It's a gorgeous museum, and as I said, it is something I would love to visit. And the pictures I'm looking at currently at the museum show that she is very far away from beaches. I can't see any beaches at all nearby, so I can avoid sandy beaches. And they have plenty of aircraft all over the hangar, and the flight deck, so I'm really happy. They have a Wildcat, which is probably my second favourite fighter of World War II. Possibly my favourite. It depends. It alternates between... Honestly, choosing between that and the Hellcat is just hard. And they have a Tomcat, so I'm really happy. They've got my favourite of the aircraft of fighters of the modern world. And they've got a Viking. Ooh, that's going to be fun. I've got to do that. Anyway. So, summary. What was she? What was her class? And I've used her as a stand-in to an extent for a lot of her class this evening. I've used her to do that because she's worthwhile. History is rarely straightforward, and you can often find multiple sources that will say multiple things, and sometimes it's making a judgment call. Sometimes it's deciding how important the illustrious class knowledge of them is to your thinking versus your pre-war planning. I would describe the Midways as a fusion of that. Others would say, look, no, they've taken the British ideas, they've taken them on board, they're going that way. And I can understand that, but I wouldn't agree with that, because I'd look at the pre-war thinking and the fact that they've been experimenting it. Just because they haven't gone that route, they've got lots of reasons to go that and not go that route because of the way it suits them at the time. They've got lots of good arguments. But still, that doesn't mean they don't want to go there. It's like, the arguments which used... I once read a paper which said the British didn't want large aircraft carriers with large air groups because they didn't think aircraft mattered. And it was a case of, no, they're literally sticking the aircraft in an armoured box because the aircraft do matter. They just don't fit, not sure how they can keep them going, and especially in a pre-radar world. And I'd argue Midway, one of the things that makes her work so well is radar. Because she's got enough armour that anything that leaks through you hope is going to be one of the lighter attackers. So she's got the armour to not sweat that and carry on. That's sensible. So I was finishing my videos with a question. This is not going to be a different one. This is going to have a question. And the question tonight is this. So, I love the Midway class. I think they're very cute ships, and as I've mentioned already many times, I'd like to visit Midway. But I'd like you to think about all the aircraft carriers which weren't preserved. All the classes which aren't there. So it can't be an Essex class, and it can't be another of the Midways. And I've already made the case the other day for Saratoga to have survived, but I'm going to add her, still let her be in. Any ships you would like, of the aircraft carriers you would like to have survived, and where would you like them to have been? Where do you think would be a good place for them to be? So any aircraft carriers you think should have been, after World War II, preserved for heritage, and where would you like them to have been? There is someone I know who thinks that a Bern should have been preserved. Mainly, they believe, as a great thing for France. I believe if it was preserved, it would be a great cautionary tale for how not to build a carrier. But we can disagree on the reasons, but I can still agree that preserving it is not something I disagree with. As much as I don't like the design and think it's a terrible idea in so many of its systems, I can still agree I think it should have been preserved. So we're coming up next week. Well, next week is the Imperial Japan... Hang on, no, it's the 845 Squadron, isn't it? Yeah, Imperial Japanese Naval Aircraft Squadron is what I'm currently recording. Oh, joy of June, I'm re-recording that. It's a fun one. It's a fun video. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. Hope you enjoyed. If you liked the video, please do consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And if you want to continue supporting the book collection that helps underpin all this, and the Iron Brew Addiction, please, there's Patreon, there's Ko-fi. Patreon, you can suggest topics for lives or premieres on the months when I'm moving house or travelling. And there's memberships also in the channel where you get some really cool emojis and support the channel and help it grow as well, because YouTube likes promoting people who are good at getting members. Their algorithm seems to factor that in. Thank you very much for watching, and take care.